BSides DC would like to thank all of our sponsors, and a special thank you to all of our speakers, volunteers, and organizers for making 2018 a success.
Welcome to Owning the Land 2018 Splinter Cell Edition / Ghost Recon. So I work for a company called Digital Silence. We're a Denver-based security consulting firm. Basically, we're a small boutique, if you will, firm of pen testers who give a shit. If you've ever had a pen test by people who don't give a shit, you probably know what I'm talking about. My name is Gabriel Ryan. I'm a co-founder, senior security assessment manager at Digital Silence. I used to work for GDS and also a Chantilly-based firm called OG Systems. Red teamer researcher, new dad actually, so hence the lack of sleep. And, my LinkedIn handle is kind of interesting. It's ms08067. So this is a talk that primarily deals with 802.1x. So before we kind of go into like the new stuff, we should probably do some background information. So let's talk about what 802.1x is. 802.1x is an authentication protocol. It's used to protect local area networks or even wireless local area networks with rudimentary authentication. 802.1x defines exchange between three parties. You basically have the supplicant, that's the client device that's trying to connect to the network. You have the authenticator, which is the network device. It's usually like a switch that is providing access to the network, so the supplicant's connecting to the authenticator to get to the network. And you have the authentication server. The authentication server, it's basically the host that's running inside the network, usually running Radius software or something similar. And its job is pretty much to make the final decisions as to whether the supplicant can access the network or not. So you can think of the authenticator as kind of a gatekeeper. The supplicant will connect to it via a switch port and provide it with its credentials, and then the authenticator is going to forward its credentials to the authentication server, at which point the authentication server is going to validate those credentials and either allow the device to access the network or not. 802.1x is typically a four-step sequence, beginning with initialization, going to initiation, Eap negotiation, finally authentication. So when we have a port that's protected by 802.1x, it can be in one of two states. Authorized, in which traffic is completely unrestricted, at least at the port level, or unauthorized, in which traffic is restricted to 802.1x traffic only. So the first step of this process we mentioned was initialization. And what this means is that during the first step, the supplicant is going to connect to the switch port, which is going to start out disabled. The authenticator is going to detect that there's a new connection there and actually enable the switch port. The switch port is going to start off in the unauthorized state. Once that happens, we proceed to initiation, which we're initiating the authentication process. The first step, which is optional, the supplicant is going to send an epool start frame. What this frame is doing is saying, hey, I want to authenticate. The authenticator is going to respond with an EAP request identity frame, and that's basically asking the supplicant, hey, who are you? Give me a username or something. The supplicant is going to send the EAP response identity frame response to that, containing an identifier, usually a username, and the authenticator is going to encapsulate that EAP response identity in something that the authentication server can understand. So it's going to encapsulate it in a Radius access request frame and forward that off to the authentication server. At that point, basically the supplicant and the authentication server haggle a bit. And the reason why they do this is that we mentioned that, well, okay, so 802.1x is basically an encapsulation of EAP, or Extensible Authentication Protocol, for use over local area networks. And the reason why EAP is known as Extensible Authentication Protocol, or Extensible, is because it's really more of a black box for performing authentication. It's more of a framework rather than a fully fledged protocol. It's defining message formats, and those message formats, it's pretty much left up to the individual implementation of EAP, and those implementations are known as Eap Methods, as to the nitty-gritty details about how the authentication should take place. So long story short, the authentication server and the supplicant, they're going to negotiate until they decide on an Eap method they're both okay with, and once they do that, they proceed to the authentication itself. And as we mentioned, the specific details are implementation specific or method specific, but the important takeaway here is that it will always result in an EAP success or EAP failure message. If you get an EAP success message, it means that the authentication has succeeded, and we at that point switch to the ports switch to an authorized state, and you can send traffic through it. Otherwise, remains unauthorized. So we mentioned EAP. What is it? So EAP, as we mentioned, it's more of an authentication framework. It only defines message formats. It's not really a fully fledged protocol itself. And we mentioned that Eap methods are what we call the individual Eap implementations. And that you can think about it as a black box for performing authentication. Some notable Eap methods, there's Eap MD5. It's been around for a really long time. Spoiler alert, it sucks. There's Eap Peep. Another spoiler, it doesn't quite suck as much as like Eap MD5, but it's still not great. I know it's soap, but it looks delicious, so I just had to throw it in there. And there's Eap TLS, which has historically been regarded as one of the better implementations of Eap, but some stuff that was released last summer just kind of a little bit throws a wrench in that. So I think we should also do a brief history of wired port security, just to kind of establish the groundwork for what we're going to talk about today. So back in 2001, the 802.1x-2010 standard was created to provide rudimentary authentication to LANs. That was the first version of the protocol. Fast forward a bit to 2004, we have the 802.1x-2004 standard. It was an amendment to the protocol that was created to, it was basically extending the protocol to facilitate its use in wireless networks as well as wired networks. In 2005, a year after that, the first major bypass for this protocol was released. Steve Riley demonstrated that you could simply put a hub between the supplicant and the authenticator, and what that would do is it would allow you to passively sniff traffic. You couldn't really inject traffic fully, because if you tried to inject TCP packets, it would cause a race condition, but you can inject UDP packets, which is still kind of cool. But it was your first real bypass for this. 6 years after that, Aab from Gremlin Security created a tool called Marvin, implemented in Java, and it was able to bypass 802.1x by introducing the rogue device directly between the supplicant and the switch. So you didn't really need a hub anymore. You could actually just put a device with two network interfaces between the supplicant and the switch, and kind of like you'd use a bridge, essentially, a Linux bridge, to forward traffic back and forth between the two of them. And it was able to interact fully with the network, so full TCP injection and full UDP using packet injection. Later that year, actually, this was one of these interesting cases where you had two people working on a similar problem at the same time, and came up with slightly different but pretty unique solutions to it. Later that year, Alva Duckwall created his own 802.1x-2004 bypass. Like Aab's bypass, he used a transparent bridge to introduce the rogue device directly between the supplicant and the switch. But what he did that was a bit different is he used source NATing instead of packet injection to achieve full network interaction. So essentially what happens there is that you use IP tables to create a source NAT. It makes it look as if all traffic originating from the rogue device is coming from the supplicant. So it's pretty cool. And we're going to talk about that more in a bit. Fast forward again to 2017, Valerian Legrand created a tool called Fenrir, which works similarly to Duckwall's tool, but implements NATing in Python using Scapy. So it basically does something similar, but just at a very high level, which makes it a bit more portable and easier to use. Has a modular design, support for responder, all kinds of interesting stuff. So I think whenever you're starting off on a research project, I think it's useful to go over the existing work, and also try to see if you can implement the existing attacks if that's just so you have a better understanding of what you're doing, and if there's room to improve them, you should do that as well. So kind of along that line of thought, one thing I did when I was starting out this project was to look at Duckwall's 802.1x bypass a bit more closely. We mentioned that it uses a transparent bridge to silently introduce the rogue device between the supplicant and authenticator, and that Duckwall's bypass uses network interaction, or achieves full network interaction by creating a source NAT to make it look like all the traffic originating from the workstation or whatever the supplicant is. It makes it look as if it's originating from the rogue device. Interesting thing is when you think about a situation where you have to bypass port security, wired port security, 802.1x, right? You're usually in a situation where it's either some kind of physical security assessment, or a lot of times it's like a red team assessment where you're basically in a physical location that you probably aren't allowed to be in, and you're leaving something behind, right? You don't want to sit there trying to mess with this stuff. You want to drop something off and then get out, and then it needs to work. So, but you need a way of connecting to the rogue device remotely while it's on someone else's network. So with that in mind, the way Duckwall kind of approached that problem is, well, he had two solutions. The first was to create a hidden SSH service using destination NATing, which is cool because you could connect to the device. If depending on what your IP address was, you could connect to it remotely. And the other solution that he provided was, and this is the one that I think he'd end up using more often, just so you can deal with stuff like NAT, was to create, basically the rogue device had the ability to tunnel outward over SSH and then create a reverse tunnel that would allow you to just punch through the firewall and into the device. So that was kind of how he achieved the remote access problem with that. There's some issues that he had to deal with. The first one was that the Linux kernel, at least at the time, it would not forward EPOL packets over a bridge. Ooh, lighting. Existing tools, they deal with this problem usually by patching the Linux kernel or relying on higher level libraries such as Scapy. So that's why Valerian Legrand was implementing everything at a higher level, is so that you didn't have to worry about patching the kernel. So, and there are problems with both of these approaches, though. Relying on kernel patches can become unwieldy. There aren't any publicly available kernel patches for modern kernel versions, and relying on high-level tools such as Scapy, it can make the bridge slow under heavy loads. And if you're introducing a bottleneck to the network, that's one surefire way to have someone go and track down your device because you're causing an outage and people will complain. Granted, I mean, at the time period when Duckwall released this thing, he didn't really have a choice in the matter. He had to use the kernel patches because that was all that there was. But fortunately, after looking into it, it turns out the situation has improved dramatically since Duckwall's contribution was released. In fact, as of 2012, ePOL bridging can actually be enabled using something called the pros file system. The pros file system, you can think about it as an API to the Linux kernel. It's basically a bunch of files. You can edit values on the fly, and it will change configurations. And one thing you can do now is you can change the value in part of the pros file system to enable ePOL bridging, which is great because it means no more patching. So that's one improvement I added. The other improvement I added was support for side channel interaction. When Duckwall created his original 802.1x bypass, he had to figure out how to provide the attacker with access to the rogue device. But remember, this was in 2011, and cellular modems were pretty unsophisticated. They were slow and they were expensive. You could just go down to Best Buy and get like an LTE dongle and plug it into your rogue device. It just wasn't an option. So that's why you had to rely on SSH. There are some problems with this approach, though. It's not perfect. It relies on the assumption that egress filtering can be bypassed, which it can't always be bypassed. And also relies on pushing traffic through the target network, which creates yet another opportunity for detection. Fortunately, now it's, we actually have a lot more available in terms of side channel options. Specifically, LTE dongles. There's different radios and stuff you can add to your device. So the updated implementation, basically, like what I did is add and modify some of the existing firewall rules from the original scripts, and add support for side channel interaction. So now you can connect over LTE if you want to, and it makes this a lot smoother. So I'm just going to demo this really fast. And so what you're seeing here, can you guys see that okay? Okay. Well, all right, we're gonna play like let's play pretend, okay? Well, it's not really pretend because it's up there, but all right, so I want you to visualize, I'm just joking. I want you to, so on the left side of the screen here, there is a terminal. And on this terminal, that terminal corresponds to a session that's SSHing into the rogue device over the side channel. And on the bottom right here, we have the switch, and there's like a little green light here, and with a Ethernet plugged into it. And when this green light is green, it means that we're currently authenticated and connected. And when it's yellow, what that means is that essentially it's currently authenticating or trying to connect. If it turns off and stays off, it means that either we've disconnected the device or we've caused a port security violation and the switch has been blocked, which is not good. And in the top right, we have a screen share of a workstation that is connected to the switch. So we've inserted our rogue device directly between this workstation in the top right and the switch. And you can see that the workstation is just constantly pinging Google, actually. Just because their DNS servers are good for this kind of stuff. So what happens is that when we connect our device, you're going to briefly see that the ping attempts start failing because and that light will turn off because we've kind of interrupted that connection. But then we're going to start our bridge-based bypass. And what that's going to do, we're going to run it now. We're going to create our bridge. And what you're going to see in a second is that yellow light turns on and then turns green, and basically the supplicant has managed to re-authenticate with the switch, and we are now sitting directly between the switch and the supplicant, and we can pretty much sniff any traffic going on between the two of them. We can use that information to get the prerequisite metadata to add full interaction. So we're going to run a second command that uses that. And that's going to give us, essentially set up our source netting, and that's going to give us our full network interaction. So we're going to do that, and it's going to run. And you can see here we've run it, and now what's going to happen on the left is that we're going to run Nmap, and we're able to actually run an Nmap scan as if we were the host up in the top right there. So that's our full a full invisible bypass. So yeah, so the reason why this works, right? All traditional 802.1x bypasses, hub-based, injection-based, bridge-based, they all take advantage of the same fundamental security flaw, and that's that 802.1x, at least in its traditional forms, up until recently, did not provide encryption, and it did not provide support for authentication on a packet-by-packet basis. Authentication happens up front, and then once it's authenticated, it's done, right? So that's why you can kind of get away with doing that. To deal with this issue, there's another amendment to the 802.1x protocol, which is actually just starting to take off. Actually the top, I want to say like 4 or 5-ish manufacturers of enterprise networking hardware are just starting to actually offer support for this in some of their higher end models. But yeah, the 802.1x 2010 protocol was designed to deal with this, and the way that it deals with this is by using something called MacSEC. And MacSEC, what it does is it provides layer 2 encryption on a hop-by-hop basis, and also provides packet-by-packet integrity checks. So if the packet gets modified anyway, you'll see that. The support for the hop-by-hop encryption is actually particularly important because not only does it protect against the bridge-based attacks that we just saw, it also allows network administrators with the means to inspect data in transit. So if you're a network administrator, you want to be able to look at what the traffic is doing, and if you encrypt everything, right, normally you think, well, that might actually work against me because now I can't look at it. But because the encryption is being implemented on a hop-by-hop basis, you can still look at it because it gets decrypted between every hop. So if you want to inspect it, you can. It's pretty cool. So the 802.1x 2010, it works in 3 stages. There's the authentication and master key distribution, and then we move to the session key agreement, and finally we move to the session secure state. We're going to talk about what these mean in a second. Authentication, it pretty much plays out like the authentication process that we described in the very beginning. With your initialization, initiation, Eap negotiation, finally move on to your Eap, whatever implementation of Eap you're using, your authentication. The only difference is that at the very end of it, you need to be able to support a few more things transmitted from the authentication server to the supplicant. But other than that, it's pretty much analogous. If we manage to get through stage 1, we then go to the stage 2, is the session key agreement, and pretty much what's going to happen there is that we're going to establish that the supplicant's actually capable of supporting MacSEC. If it is, we're going to install this the SAC and key name on the supplicant. Once we do that, we move to stage 3, and that's the session secure state. And that, by the way, once we've reached stage 3, that is when we are actually protecting all this communication using that layer 2 encryption, using MacSEC. So if we think about how you could bypass something like this, because our traditional methods kind of go out the window when we have to deal with this new version of the protocol. Well, this passage in the IEEE 802.1x 2010 standard, actually it's section 6.6 if you want to look it up. It actually kind of like stuck out at me, and the reason for that, well, if you read it, it pretty much says that the layer 2 encryption provided by MacSEC is actually in some ways comparable to to similar forms of protection that you'd see protecting wireless networks using 802.11. So I think what they're really referring to here is WPA. And actually, if you look at this closely, there are some parallels between MacSEC and WPA. And whenever you're trying to find some way of exploiting some new software, or even finding a weakness in a fairly new technology, it's always useful to look for parallels between whatever you're working with and stuff that has been compromised in the past. So with that in mind, if we look back to 2003, WPA1 was released. And what was the cool new feature of WPA1? Well, it was offering hop-by-hop layer 2 encryption. At this point, with WPA, it was offering it from the access point to the station. But authentication was provided by Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP. And you could also use PSK, pre-shared key, as a fallback or alternative. When this was released, we had to, the wireless security community pretty much had to, or at least the offensive wireless security community had to pretty much undergo a pretty big paradigm shift, because up until then, people were relying on injection-based attacks. They were relying on sniffing, man-in-the-middle attacks and stuff like that. And that didn't really work as well anymore, particularly once we moved on to WPA2. So there had to be a focus shift, and that focus shift was from those style attacks to attacking the authentication mechanism. So you started to see, instead of attacking WPA itself, people would attack the authentication mechanism. So they attack the PSK, which is when you see the traditional WPA handshake capture and dictionary attack, and more recently the PMKID attacks. And for enterprise networks, you'd see the rogue AP attacks against weak Eap methods. If we fast forward a bit to 2010, 802.1x-2010 is released. And what's it providing? It's also providing hop-by-hop layer 2 encryption, this time using MacSEC. This time it's providing that hop-by-hop layer 2 encryption between the device to the switch or the switch to the switch. But like WPA, the authentication is provided by Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP, or PSK as a fallback or alternative. You kind of see where I'm going with this. So basically, the initial hypothesis from this should be, could you perform a similar shift of focus to achieve similar results with MacSEC? So obviously our bridge and injection-based attacks aren't really possible anymore due to the introduction of that layer 2 encryption. So the first thing that comes to mind is to try attacking the authentication mechanism, especially if you're like a wireless, come from a wireless background. It's like, well, I've seen this over here. Why not try it in this environment? My guess would be that the PSK implementation of this might be vulnerable to some kind of dictionary attack. I'm still working on that, so I really have no idea. But EAP, which is what we're talking about today, it does make sense that you could also use attacks against weak EAP methods, which is kind of the main takeaway of this talk. So to kind of understand what we mean by attacks against weak EAP methods, we kind of have to look at Wpa2 Eap a bit. The most commonly, I love that sound. So the most commonly seen EAP method is Eap. And basically, the way that works is that you have the supplicant, which is your wireless device. It's going to try to connect to the network, and when it does that, it's going to have to send an authentication request to the authentication server. The authentication server is going to reply with an X59 certificate. Now, the reason why the authentication server has to give the supplicant this X59 certificate is that it needs to prove its identity to the supplicant. Before the supplicant receives the X59 certificate, it doesn't really know who it's connecting to. So the supplicant's going to look at the certificate and decide whether or not it can trust the server. If the certificate's valid and it trusts the certificate, then it trusts the server. If not, this entire process is aborted because it doesn't want to authenticate with something that isn't what it's actually trying to authenticate with. So, once that happens, if the supplicant accepts the certificate, we move from what's known as like phase 1 or the outer authentication phase to the inner authentication phase, or phase 2, which is going to happen through a secure tunnel. So essentially, a secure tunnel is going to be established between the supplicant and the authentication server, because without that secure tunnel, even if this is part of WPA, remember you don't get access to WPA until this entire process completes. So you need a secure tunnel to protect what's going to happen next, and basically what's going to happen is that the supplicant's going to send hashed versions of its what's going to be issued a challenge from the server, and then essentially it's going to send a response back to the server that's derived from the challenge and its password, and that's going to be sent through the secure tunnel to the server, and depending on whether that response is valid or not, it's going to be either allowed to access the network or it's not going to be allowed to access the network. Authentication is going to fail. So back in 2008, two researchers named Brad Antoniewicz and Josh Wright, they figured out that you could use something called a rogue access point attack to force a supplicant to authenticate with a rogue authentication server. What do we mean by this? So in case you're unaware of what a rogue access point attack is, so if you see this diagram here, essentially we have this access point here, and hack was open, and it's running on channel 6, and we have these 4 laptops that are connected to it. Essentially, rogue access point attack is when you create another access point, you force all these devices to connect to it. Easiest way to do that is just to use the same ESSID and channel as the target access point, and then make sure that you're providing a better signal. And if you do that, those devices will roam to you, and then you have that man in the middle established. And once you do that, you can then actually, if your target is a Wpa2 Eap access point and your access point is a Wpa2 Eap access point, you can then force them to authenticate with you instead of the intended authentication server, and capture those hashes, which you then crack, and then you can use that to get radius credentials, which you can use to access the network. That kind of makes sense to everyone, by the way, because that's super important. Okay, good stuff. Right, so the biggest problem here, by the way, is that the onus is kind of on the supplicant to either accept or deny the certificate, which causes problems. But To make matters worse, by the way, with Eap, typically you're going to see, there's actually like even more flexibility. We mentioned that extensible authentication protocol, can be implemented in any number of ways. Well, this phase 2 that happens through the tunnel, actually you have different options available to you of what you can use for that. The most common inter-authentication method or protocol is MSCHAP-v2. And essentially MSCHAP-v2, back in 2012, two researchers named Marlinspike and David Holton, they discovered some cryptographic weaknesses in this protocol that essentially they figured out that MSCHAP-v2 is pretty much analogous to NTLM-v1 in that you can reduce it to a single 56 bits of DES encryption, which is not great. In fact, they discovered that once you did that using, well, they had a $100,000 cracking rig at the time, but that cracking rig, if you bought something with similar processing power now, several years later, you could get one for 10, 20 grand, something like that. But they discovered, with sufficiently powerful hardware, you could then, convert those 56 bits into a password equivalent NT hash within 24 hours with a 100% success rate, regardless of the length of the password, which is, pretty bad. So basically, once you get those hashes using this method, you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to crack them, particularly because you can specify the challenge, that is used to derive that response and therefore remove a lot of the entropy from the protocol. So going, kind of fast forward back to 802.1x 2010. Why are we talking about all this Wpa2 stuff? Well, the most important takeaway about 802.1x 2010, at least from an attacker's perspective, is that it still uses EAP to authenticate devices to the network. And EAP, as we kind of looked at just a second ago, is only as secure as the Eap method used. The 802.1x 2010 standard allows any EAP method so long as it supports mutual authentication, supports the derivation of keys that are at least 128 bits in length, and generates an MSK of at least 64 octets. And there are plenty of commonly seen EAP methods that meet these requirements. Eap Peep, which we just described, Eap TTLS, which is similar enough to Eap Peep that if you understand Eap Peep and the issues that affect it, you can understand Eap TTLS as well. I think you kind of see where we're going with this once again. And this is the part where we talk about, well, this slide says defeating MacSEC using rogue gateway attacks. That's kind of misleading because we're not actually defeating MacSEC. We're cowardly avoiding MacSEC and attacking EAP instead, like we've been doing for 10 years. Because I'm lazy and, well, isn't everyone, but, so the goal of a rogue gateway attack, much like a rogue AP attack, is to force the supplicant to authenticate with your device. How do you do that? And once you do that, you can crack the hashes that it sends you, and you can use those to authenticate with the network. When we looked at 802.1x 2004, we were using a man-in-the-middle style bypass. You can see this diagram here. Essentially, we're placing the rogue device directly between the supplicant and the authenticator. As of right now, there really isn't a way to do that if you're dealing with 802.1x 2010, so you kind of have to go for direct access. You need to steal credentials and then authenticate directly with the switch, which is what we're going to try to do. So if we were going to build a rogue device that could do this kind of attack, how do we do it? Well, so first step would be to set up our core device, and you can see here we're including our transparent bridge capabilities there just because they're useful, although not necessarily for this, but it's good to have them. But that's there in case we need it. But the main features of this, you're going to need an upstream interface. Your upstream interface is going to be connected, the interface is connected to, it's going to be facing toward the switch, right? And your PHY interface is going to be our second interface we're going to be using, and that's going to be facing toward the supplicant. We also have our side channel interface, which we talked about earlier, and that will give us the ability to control this device remotely. And you can just put this on like a small microcomputer. I use an Intel NUC running Fedora 28 because Fedora 28 has good support for MacSEC, but you could use anything that could really support MacSEC, to be honest, and Linux. But we need a way of diverting traffic to the rogue device, and we can't just perform a rogue AP attack because we're not on a wireless network anymore. We're on a wired network, so we're kind of out of luck there. So the question is, how do we do that? Well, if we look at this picture here, can you guys kind of see the picture there with the train tracks? Okay, awesome. So we see these train tracks here, and you see, these tracks go like two ways. The first direction is just straight ahead, and that goes directly into the station. But there's a mechanical switch here that will actually redirect the railroad traffic to the right, and it will bypass that station up there. So, position A, you go to the station, switch moves into position B, and you bypass it entirely. You can actually do something similar with Ethernet. You can get these little devices here on Amazon for, I think it was like $5, $10, something like that. It's basically a mechanical Ethernet splitter. It just has two buttons on it, and depending on which one you hit, the Ethernet traffic will be routed through port A or port B. That's a really rudimentary way of redirecting traffic. Of course, you really can't just be unless you want to have someone hide in a closet and then just on signal just switch the traffic to the rogue device on the network you're attacking. You can't really just use these as they are. You have to find some way of manipulating the push switch. There are a couple ways you can go about this. The first of which you could use something called a relay basically the way a relay works in very crude terms, because I'm not an electrical engineer, is that depending if you have like a high or low current running through it, it will send the traffic one direction or the other, or the signal one way or the other. It's very hard to implement something like that with Ethernet without causing impedance issues, which is why if you buy an Ethernet relay on the internet, it'll cost you like $1,000. Sorry, because they're pretty difficult to make. But option B is to use something called a solenoid. And there are a couple kinds of solenoids. Basically, they're push solenoids and pull solenoids. But what a solenoid is, it's a metal rod, and it's wrapped in this metal coil. And when you run electricity through this coil, if it's a pull solenoid, it will actually pull the metal rod inward, creating a pulling motion. And if it's a push solenoid, when you run electricity through this coil, it'll push the solenoid outward. Actually, depending on the size of solenoid you can get, it can have quite a lot of force to it. But I mean, yeah, it's basically a linear motor, which is kind of what we need here, pushing motion specifically. So that's pretty much how I figured out how to manipulate the switches. Is just have a pair of solenoids. They're controlled by a Arduino microcontroller that's then kind of being used as a slave to the primary device here. But the full bypass, or the full setup that you see, essentially, it would look like this. You'd have the device we just talked about with our two interfaces, our upstream interface and our PHY interface, as well as our side channel interface. But we'd also have on either side, we'd have two of these mechanical AB Ethernet splitters. We have an upstream one and a PHY splitter as well. When these splitters are in position A, the traffic essentially is rerouted so that it bypasses a rogue device entirely. And we also set up like a little lamp tap. Have you guys seen the throwing star lamp tap before? Yeah, so pretty much that concept, right? You have this little thing on the wire there so that Ethernet traffic kind of spills out one direction but can't get back. And that allows us to passively look at the traffic that's going between here. And it's going to be encrypted, so we can't really see much, but we can see metadata, which is what we need. We need MAC addresses and stuff like that. So we have that. That's position A. We put the switches in position B, and it will reroute traffic to our device. So basically, it will connect the switch to our upstream interface and the workstation, or supplicant, should I say, to our PHY interface. So actually, how do we implement this attack? We take this device configuration and drop it directly between the supplicant, which is here, this workstation here on the right, and the switch, which is on the left. And what we do is we bring down our upstream interface, bring down our transparent bridge because we don't really need it for this, but we leave our PHY interface up, and we'd run host APD, which is essentially it runs a radius server essentially that you can run on your Linux laptop or whatever you're using. And we'd run that and have it listen on our PHY interface. And as the supplicant's rerouted, we then we then prompt it to authenticate with our host APD instance here, our radius server, and it will do so. And when it does so, we just capture the challenge response in a similar way that we would if we were attacking a wireless network. We crack them, and then once they're cracked, what we can do is we can then bring down the PHY interface and bring the upstream interface back up, and then authenticate directly with the network using valid EAP credentials, the supplicant's MAC address, and you also would just set a static IP address for yourself that would match the one used by the supplicant. That way you kind of blend in and look exactly like the supplicant would, at least from that perspective. Granted, this last phase you want to probably do like in the middle of the night or some time in which you're unlikely to cause a noticeable disruption when you do this. But I mean, just do it at the end of the day or on a weekend or something like that. No one will notice. So here's a demo of this. So like before, our setup, the way it works is, we have our attacker's device. We're going to SSH into our rogue device on the left. We have our workstation we have a screen share of our workstation on the right. It's just going to be pinging stuff continuously, so you can see it's actually connecting out to the outside internet through our switch. We have our switch now is in kind of in the bottom middle there, and here's a very big version of this device. And the reason for that is if you're ever creating something for the first time, do you ever read or see Frankenstein? You know how you use like really big parts to build a thing because it's easier to work with. It's the same concept. You can make a smaller version of this, but it's just easier to deal with. So you see we're going to run this, and you're actually going to hear the solenoids working in a second. I don't know if you guys can hear that. So those are the solenoids kind of flipping around. And what you should see in a second now is that we're going to force the, okay, so yeah, we've just forced it to authenticate. We're able to capture those hashes, and then we crack them, and we're able to authenticate with the network, regardless of the fact that they're using MacSEC. So that's our 802.11/2000X, or 802.1x-2010 bypass, should I say. Okay, so we have a bit of time left. So it's going to do a quick detour now. There's some other stuff that kind of ended up working on, well, in the process of working on the 802.1x-2010 stuff. We're going to talk about Mac filtering and Mac authentication bypass, or MAB. You MAB bro. So fun fact, not all devices support 802.1x, whether you're a sysadmin or a pen tester or whatever, you've probably run into this before, right? Not all devices support 802.1x, yet enterprise organizations typically need to be able to place these devices within their 802.1x protected networks anyways. So historically, the solution whenever you run into this issue is to simply disable 802.1x/2010 or 802.1x on the port used by that device. When you do this, you're creating what's known as a port security exception. You know, usually at this point, you replace 802.1x with some other more rudimentary form of port security, such as Mac filtering. But the important part is that you're making exceptions within your 802.1x coverage and for certain ports, so that certain devices can connect to your network. So historically, these port security exceptions have been very prevalent, and this is due to the widespread lack of 802.1x support by peripheral devices. So, you know, basically, you know, rolling out 802.1x is one thing. Rolling 802.1x when you have to connect a multifunction printer to your network or IP cameras, stuff like that, is another, because they traditionally have had some pretty poor support for 802.1x. And these port security exceptions have historically pretty much created pretty low-hanging fruit for attackers. It's much easier to try to actually to simply spoof a MAC address than it is to try to actually bypass 802.1x using a bridge or a hub. The problem is, at least from the perspective of attackers, that port security exceptions are slowly dying. I mean, they're still pretty prevalent, but you know, we're seeing less and less of them. And the reason for that is that support for 802.1x by peripheral devices, or peripheral device manufacturers, has increased dramatically, which is actually a pretty good thing. You know, legacy hardware is being phased out over time. Either it breaks and has to be replaced, or there's some kind of schedule where you have to replace it. And you know, if you just go online, if you just go on Newegg or something like that, or you know, some equivalent, you'll notice that pretty much all the major manufacturers of say, you know, printers and scanners, they all support at least one model that supports 802.1x that is pretty well within the price range of something that could be, you know, fit within the budget of an enterprise organization or even a small business for that matter. So, you know, the effect of this is that, you know, port security exceptions have become less prevalent. I mean, you still see them quite a bit, but not like you used to. And they're definitely not the low-hanging fruit that they used to be. The thing to keep in mind, though, is improved adoption for 802.1x doesn't necessarily imply strong port security for peripheral devices. Remember that 802.1x/2010 is just starting to take off for, you know, very, very expensive networking hardware, and it's really not a reality at all yet for peripheral devices. And if they're using 802.1x/2004, you know, we can always just bypass it using bridges, injections, etc. But one thing that's kind of interesting about this is that, you know, we were talking about, you know, insecure Eap methods. We can actually expect these to be, the adoption of secure Eap methods to be even lower for peripheral devices than we would from something that can be centrally managed, like a domain joined device. So this kind of begs the question: can we just attack Eap as like a really easy way to attack these devices? And this kind of makes sense as an alternative to relying on port security exceptions for attacking peripherals. You know, one thing that you could do is you could actually, if you wanted to capture, you know, 802.1x credentials on a network that's that's protected by 802.1x/2004, you could use the rogue gateway tech. Although in this case, it's actually much simpler to implement. You wouldn't need to rely on solenoids. You can instead just kind of use the bridge-based techniques we were looking at earlier. You can see this is a diagram that's very similar to the one that we used for the 802.1x/2010 bypass. But we don't have any solenoids here. Instead, we have the upstream interface, the PHY interface, but then between it, we have this transparent bridge, which is what we were using to do the original 802.1x/2004 bypass. So we start out just passively sniffing traffic. That allows us to gather, you know, any metadata that we need to perform the attack. And then when we're ready to actually perform to actually capture some credentials, we just bring down our upstream interface and our bridge and start running host ABD on the PHY interface. And like before, the supplicant will authenticate with us and we'll be able to capture and crack those hashes and connect to the network that way. But we don't even need to do that. And the reason for that is that a lot of peripheral devices actually still use Eap MD5. And the reason for that is that Eap MD5, it's an older, significantly less secure Eap method, but it's also very easy to set up and configure, and it's still better than MAC filtering. So if you kind of, have to, are in a situation where you have to set up, 802.1x across the entire network, technically you could say you're doing that if you are putting Eap MD5 on your peripheral devices. I mean, it's still Eap MD5, but, technically it's 802.1x, right? So the way Eap MD5 works, it's similar to Peep, but essentially what's happening here, you're going to start out with the authentication server is going to send the supplicant an Eap request at any frame. Like before, the supplicant's going to respond to that with its identity, which is usually like a username or something like that. And the authentication server at this point is going to send the supplicant an Eap Challenge Response, and the challenge response essentially it's a randomly generated string of characters. That what the supplicant's going to do with that is it's going to concatenate it with its username or ID, and also with its password. And it's going to take that concatenated string and throw it through the MD5 hash function, and the output of that MD5 hash function becomes the challenge response, which is sent back to the server. Now what the server is going to do is the server is actually going to do the same thing. It's going to take the password, the identity, and the challenge string, concatenate them together and throw them through the hash function. And if the output that the server gets matches the challenge response received from the supplicant, then authentication succeeds. If it doesn't, then we have an authentication failure. So unlike Eap though, this is all happening over plain text. There's no secure tunnel protecting this process. So what that means is that, and this was once again, at the same time the attacks against Eap were released, Brad Antonowicz and Josh Wright released these attacks as well. Pretty much the only secret here, the only unknown is the password. You can sniff everything else. And what that means is you can actually just use a dictionary attack to obtain the password, and using all that captured data. It is a dictionary attack, so it has a if you think about it, it's kind of slow. It's not really the fastest attack ever. But I mean, the good news is in 2012, so 4 years after that, after the original attacks against the Eap MD5 were released, two researchers named Fanbei Liu and Tao Zi actually discovered that you could use a length recovery attack to significantly speed up the cracking process for Eap MD5 hashes. So actually, it's pretty trivial to capture those hashes, and then you can crack them pretty quickly as well. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. But so leveraging what we know about how to attack Eap MD5 and also how to attack 802.1x 2004, if we wanted to capture, go a step further and actually capture 802.1x credentials on a wired network, we can think about how we do this. So we can start out by using a bridge-based approach to place a rogue device directly between the supplicant and authenticator, and then we just wait for the supplicant to authenticate. And remember, we're sniffing traffic between these two devices, so that would allow us to sniff the Eap MD5 challenge, the Eap MD5 response, and then we're able to crack the credentials and then connect to the network directly using the cracked credentials. One major drawback to this approach, we have to wait for the supplicant to re-authenticate with a switch, and this actually will not happen unless the supplicant is unplugged. Disabling a virtual network interface is not enough. It won't guarantee a re-authentication. And we could use mechanical splitters to kind of trigger that, but the less overhead the better. So there actually is a better option. We can use something called the Eap MD5 forced re-authentication attack, which is kind of what I came up with to deal with this scenario. So remember we mentioned that the first two steps of the Eap authentication process are that the supplicant is going to send the authenticator an Eap start frame, and the authenticator is going to send the supplicant, going to respond to that with an Eap request identity frame. We mentioned that first step, though, is optional, and that actually has significance. Because the problem with that being optional, well, the reason why that's optional, first of all, is that the authenticator needs a way of forcing the supplicant to re-authenticate if necessary. But the problem is that the supplicant has no way of verifying if incoming Eap request identity frames have been sent in response to an Eap start frame or if they've been spoofed, right? Because this is kind of a stateless process. So what this means is that we can force re-authentication by sending an Eap start frame to the authenticator as if it came from the supplicant using MAC spoofing. The result of this is that essentially the supplicant's going to the authenticator will send an EAP request at any frame to, oh, thank you so much. That's amazing. So the result of this is that the authenticator is going to send the EAP request at any frame. Like if we do this, let me rewind a bit. So if we were to send an equal start frame to the authenticator as if it came from the supplicant using MAC spoofing, what would happen is that the authenticator would send an EAP request at any frame to the actual supplicant, and that would kickstart the reauthentication process. And when this happens, both the authenticator and supplicant will believe that the other party has initiated the reauthentication attempt, which is pretty cool because you don't really know why this happened. So you can see here what this means is that we can actually just force the supplicant to reauthenticate at will. So just by injecting these frames, you can force that reauthentication process to happen over and over and over again, pretty arbitrarily. So this is great because it allows us to actually perform this attack a lot faster. Previously we had to wait for this device the reauthentication to happen on its own, and now you can actually kickstart the authentication process by injecting those equal start frames. And that allows us to perform this forced reauthentication attack where we force it to reauthenticate and then pretty much instantly are able to grab those hashes, which we can then crack. So, there's a proposed mitigation for this, which would be just adding a safety bit to the EAP request identity frame. That's not surefire. Like, I didn't really think about that much, but like that would be a good first step in kind of thinking about how to address that issue. But yeah. Just to kind of wrap this up, the main contributions that we've talked about here, we've introduced the rogue gateway attack, which can be used to bypass 802.1x-2010 by attacking its authentication mechanism. In cases where weak Eap methods are used, we've basically updated and improved the existing 802.1x-2004 bypass techniques, made them a lot easier to use, and bundled them into a pretty easy to use Python tool. So, less monkeying around with bash scripts and stuff like that, and you can just run it and it works, which is great for red teaming scenarios and stuff like that. And we've also introduced the Eap MD5 forced reauthentication attack, which is our improved attack against Eap MD5 on wired networks. I guess the key takeaways of this talk. So port security is still a very positive thing. Definitely keep using it. This is not to discourage anyone from not using port security. But it's not a substitute for a layered approach to network security. Deploying 802.1x doesn't really absolve you from patch management responsibilities, managing user privileges, stuff like that. It should be part of the entire kind of holistic approach you take to security. The benefits provided by 802.1x, they can be undermined due to continued use of EAP as an authentication mechanism, and specifically weak EAP methods. And finally, improved 802.1x support by peripheral devices, or peripheral device manufacturers, should I say, is largely undermined by lack of support for 802.1x 2010, and also low adoption rates for strong EAP methods that can't be bypassed using the attacks we just saw. If you want to go into this in a little more detail, there's a white paper and blog post about this. It's on my company website. And also, if you want to check out the tool and kind of do these attacks yourself, it's available on GitHub. It's a tool called Silent Bridge. It's pretty, right now just plop it on a Ubuntu device or a Kali device and it should run. And you can do all this stuff. Any questions? No questions? One question, cool.
How do you get past the certificate of authentication to way back earlier on you talked about looking at the interior of the inner traffic frame.
Yeah.
You have enough TLS authenticated session. How do you force that to be?
So you're talking about if they're using just pure EAP TLS with mutual certificate authentication. Yes. Well, that doesn't address that, because that's if they're certificate-based authentication, in that case they're not using a weak EAP method, so it kind of would like.
You're still using TLS even if you only have a one-sided certificate, right?
Right. But if it's only a one-sided certificate, then it's pretty much up to the supplicant whether or not to reject that certificate, and that historically doesn't really have a really high success rate. I mean, you usually can find a device that either doesn't validate at all or leaves it up to the user, which is even worse, and then the user gets prompted, do you want access to your internet still? And then they say yes, and they connect. But yeah, that is kind of the tipping point, whether or not the device either rejects it, accepts it automatically, or, but I mean, what's interesting is that I've seen that, you know, if you have an organization usually that does a really good job of enforcing that across the board, they've typically also, you know, gone with the full mutual certificate-based authentication as well, because if you're going through that length, you might as well just throw all of it there. But yeah, that's kind of the mitigation there. Yes?
Small question with regard to the solenoids that you were setting up.
Sure.
You made mention that you implemented or you utilized Arduino in order to drive the solenoid.
Yes, sir.
Why, you know, just a question, why use solenoids instead of just using Arduino directly to go into the switch that controls the Ethernet switch instead of taking out the solenoid?
Honestly, do you want the honest answer? Because I'm a software guy, and I had to learn the hardware stuff just to do this. I'm not going to lie to you about that. But you know, the cool, you know, the plus side of that though is that it does kind of create a solution where if someone wants to go replicate it, it's not that hard to do. But yeah, there's definitely like better ways to implement it.
You don't get those cool sounds.
You don't get the cool sounds too. You don't get some user like, huh, this is awesome. My computer's making clicking noises now. It must like me. I don't know. Yeah. Good question though. If you have a better idea, like I would love to like incorporate it because it's not my area. I should talk to you after this, I think. But any other questions? Okay, cool.